So this is our reading group, continuing our reading of Neofinalism. So we're in chapter 3, which we started last time. We're picking up from page 18. So as the title of the book suggests, this book is about the concept of finalism or teleology or goal-directedness. How we can understand goal-directedness not exclusively as a human capacity. So obviously people can act in such a way as to achieve a certain goal. But for Ruyer, this is characteristic of all living beings. And then I don't know if he's going to get into it in this book, but also extends, beyond living beings to anything that is what he calls a true form. So that includes like subatomic particles. And so he contrasts that with aggregates. So, a pile of sand is not a true form. Like each grain of sand is just sort of interacting with its neighbors in a mechanical way, and it doesn't make a difference to the grain of sand whether it's in a pile or not. It just sort of responds to the pushes and friction and so on from its neighbors in this mechanical way. But for a living cell, for example, it does make a big difference whether it's inside an organism or not. And so that's sort of like what, at a very sort of simple level, what the difference between a true form and an aggregate is. So this chapter, the title of this chapter is Finalist Activity and Organic Life. And so the first bit that we read in this chapter was talking about, primarily looking at Dilthey, who was a philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th century, who established this very influential distinction in sort of epistemology or philosophy of science between understanding and explaining. So the Geisteswissenschaften, the human sciences, I guess you could say, things like history, literature, philosophy, I guess, would probably fall under that category for him. These are disciplines that require a kind of understanding of the subject matter. So you study a poem, for example, you have to sort of grasp the meaning of, not just at the basic level, the meaning of the words and the grammatical constructions and so on, but what is the role of these images and metaphors and so on in this text. And then in the natural sciences, there's no place for understanding in this sense. You're just giving causal explanations for why the orbits of the planets have this form or this speed or whatever, or why this chemical reacts in this way with this other chemical. And so in this sort of division of labor, I guess, between the understanding and explaining sort of approaches to the world, there's a kind of, it sort of splits the concept of life down that line as well, because you have life in the sort of biographical sense. So if you are a biographer of a person or a historian who is studying, sort of, I don't know, Julius Caesar or Napoleon or some other sort of famous figure, you would talk about life in terms of that person's life history, and that's something that you would have to understand. So, how did this person experience their childhood, and how did that, shape the way that they approach the world later on, etc. This is a matter of understanding. But then there's also life in the biological sense, where you're studying, plants, animals, etc., looking at how they develop and interact with each other, and this is all sort of in causal terms. But Ruyer points out that this is kind of like, by making this sort of split within the concept of life, you kind of it sort of artificially separates things that are not really separable. And one of his examples for or I think a very incisive example is cooking or culinary arts. So cooking, of course, I mean, food is obviously a biological necessity for human beings. We need to eat food to keep the human organism alive. But at the same time, it's also a very culturally specific sort of understanding type of domain. Like if you want to grasp, what exactly is going on when people are eating, you have to have an understanding of what different kinds of food mean for those people. Are they like foods that are specific to a certain festival, or part time of the year, or are they just sort of everyday foods? Are they considered, delicacies or staples or whatever? Are they appropriate for a certain time of day and not for others? So these are all like culturally determined things or questions that there's nothing intrinsic about a certain kind of food product that makes it a breakfast food and not a dinner food, for example. So like this sort of domain of human existence, cooking and eating, if you sort of make this strict distinction between understanding and explaining, you have to sort of like artificially draw a line down the middle of cooking, and say like one half of cooking is like biological and then another half is cultural, which kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense. And he also points out that like a lot of the techniques of cooking are essentially just sort of externalizing digestion tasks. So I mean, like boiling, putting food in boiling water, for example, is just sort of like pre-digesting it to make it easier to eat. Like I don't know, rice, for example, is not something that we can easily digest without cooking it first in water. And so if this breaking down task is biological when it happens inside us, it seems strange to say that the same kind of process is now this cultural phenomenon when it happens outside of us. It seems like we should have a sort of common description of this, making the chemicals within rice available to human metabolism. It should be the same kind of thing, whether it's happening in our body or in a pot on a stove. And so, yeah, so this is sort of like a general, like he's taking this one specific case as to point us towards, I guess, like a unified concept of life that would not be either biological or biographical. But these two, like this, understanding and explaining would sort of like coincide in the case of life in this unified sense. Yeah, so that's, I guess, sort of an example, or it's sort of meant to kind of break down our presupposition that teleology is a specifically human, in the sense of like cultural understanding faculty. And so, our the sort of biological side of human existence should also be understood in terms of teleology, is what he's going to argue. Okay, so let's pick up from page 18, buying bicarbonate.
I can read. Buying bicarbonate at a pharmacy is an act of the organism, just like secreting pancreatic fluid. Both of these acts have the same goal. By dint of regularly seeing X, our neighbor, go to the pharmacy or to the grocery store, we no longer see in these habitual actions the biological acts that social activity covers over, or we have the impression that there is no connection between the two levels of activity. It is even more difficult to see in X, our neighbor with whom we are chatting, the embryo that his actual body continues, and in the effort he makes to speak, the sequence of efforts that this embryo had to make to constitute a larynx and a tongue for itself. A rough schema can help us to rediscover this underneath. Figure 5, there's a straight line with arrows going to the right. The left side is labeled fertilized egg. Underneath it is embryogenesis and development of organs. To the right is labeled adult. Underneath it is instinctive or intelligent behavior, development of tools. So we're supposed to see the embryogenetic developed organs as at least analogous to the development of tools, or for the same reason it is impossible to recognize in a finalist sense, to recognize a finalist sense in the invention of utensils, and to deny it to the organs of ingestion, digestion, and assimilation. The teeth are grinding tools, the stomach a retort and an automatic mixer. The adult cook fabricates utensils or obtains them from a shop, but the adult himself, with his stomach and his brain, is the outcome of an embryonic creation, whose principle is concealed from us, but whose work only has a sense, because it prolongs itself externally according to this sense, through senseful techworks. The instinctive behavior in an external circuit is normally interposed between organic activity and intelligent finalist act. Instinct, with some exceptions, does not fabricate tools and unfolds less in the quote-unquote external world in the human and industrial sense of the than in a biological umwelt given with the organism. It is moreover difficult to isolate organogenesis from because an organ almost always has like a tool that has a handle and with one of the two poles directed toward it. When this infant is in, it is impossible not to recognize that instinctive tech belongs organogenesis. The spider's art of weaving clearly extends the formation of his silk glands. That, more generally, animal behavior is a, quote, regulation in external circuit. Warm-blooded animals who instinctively seek heat and cold according to the needs of their bodies extend with their behavior the action of organic mechanisms that regulate body's temperature. What is true for instinctive behavior is equal, and in humans as in chimpanzees, the instinctive gesture is very often the germ of an elementary intuition. Only progressively is this intuition emancipated instinct in the biological. The invention of clothing, of weaving, and of the treatment of fur, and the invention of heated suits for aviators are thermic regulations in external circuit. In many cases, we can discover three corresponding levels: organogenesis, instinctive behavior, and intelligent activity. Hence the formation of organic reserves, fat, sugars, instinctive reserves, honey, various provisions, and intelligent reserves, in Eskimos' meat caches, our jams and what. So long as we only consider instinctive behavior, it is vaguely possible at the price of some bad faith and a good deal of nudging in the right direction, and provided we first imagine that organogenesis itself can be explained by physicochemical causes, to argue that instinctive behavior can be explained in the same way. But if we add the intelligent human behavior to the series, the theory becomes untenable. Humans exist in their activity reveals the true nature of organic. At times, human activity contradicts organic activity. Humans can commit suicide, can curse, lie, but the man who commits suicide uses his own organs to destroy them. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to this position, but I know he hasn't really. I think in the next chapter he's going to, start explicitly arguing for this finalism and organic activity. But, it doesn't follow just from the fact that we could, I think, it wouldn't be inconsistent or logically contradictory to say that, finalist activity only arises at the level of the conscious, symbolic being, and that, instinctive here is not necessarily finalistic. I think some of the arguments in Merleau-Ponty that we read are good arguments for kind of sense and meaning in the life of non-human animals. But yeah, his point here seems to be that instinct becomes intelligent in human beings, and so I guess it's arbitrary to exclude it. Non-intelligent instinct in organogenesis, but he hasn't really given us a reason for that.
Yeah, I think, we're going to get more, development of this argument over the course of the book. But I think, the idea here is basically just to depict intelligent behavior in a sense of, a person with an explicit intention, sort of thinking through the problem and deciding on a course of action to realize that intention, as one end of the spectrum. And then the other end of the spectrum is the formation of organs in a living being, and to sort of present this as a spectrum, as a sort of continuous chain that goes from organogenesis to instinctive behavior to intelligent behavior. And because we can clearly sort of grasp the goal-directedness of intelligent behavior, and this is basically where this notion of goal-directedness comes from, there's no sort of point in that spectrum where you can sort of make a division and say everything on this side of this line is intelligent, is goal-directed, and then everything on this other side is sort of a purely mechanical process. So I think this is interesting as well because of the long tradition of taking tool use as sort of characteristic of human beings, which turns out not to be actually that useful, because there's many other animals that also use tools that it's only, I guess, maybe in the last 50 or so years that this has really started to be studied more carefully. But some of the famous examples are chimpanzees that stick twigs into an ant nest and then pull out the ants to eat. There are lots of birds that will use stones to break open nuts. There are also otters that they have a specific stone, and they actually keep it with them all the time and use it to break open the shells of various mollusks. They carry around like a shell breaking stone with them. But yeah, so this sort of tool use as like sort of the paradigmatic intelligent behavior of a human being turns out to actually be much broader, have a much broader scope in within the natural world. And oh yeah, this example, this is a cool one. Yeah, so Angus has put in the chat here that there are crows in Japan that I think they even like make use of the traffic lights if I remember correctly. They like put nuts on the road. So like when the light is red in that direction, they'll put them on the road, and then they fly up and wait for the light to change, and then the cars run over the nuts and crack the shells, and then the light changes again. And they go back and pick up all the edible parts of the nut. So yeah, they're making use of us as their tools, I guess. Um, but yeah, so like if we sort of in this tradition of like taking tool use as like sort of paradigmatic of human intelligence, if we then find that there are many other animals that use tools in various ways, that we can sort of I guess that we can see how the idea of goal directedness kind of sort of blends into the idea of instinctive behavior. Like there are many cases where animals act where it seems implausible to sort of attribute an understanding of a goal to them. You have like salmon that swim upstream to mate. Like they these like it seems unrealistic to suppose that these fish have like a representation of, oh, I want to go to this place so I can mate. They just have some sort of drive to swim in this direction. That seems much more plausible. But at the same time, there's like a sort of continuity between this sort of goal directed, or sorry, this sort of like drive, this sort of blind drive towards a certain place, and then more, I guess, sophisticated navigation. Like there are migratory birds, for example, that are capable of navigating across many thousands of kilometers, and they make use of multiple different sort of environmental cues to navigate. So they use I think there are some birds that it seems like they can detect the Earth's magnetic field as part of it, so they almost have like a compass in their heads. And there are other birds that can hear infrasound, which is like sound waves below the frequency that the minimum frequency that humans can hear, and the sort of flow of air over geographical features like mountains and so on produces a sort of characteristic infrasound, and so they can sort of hear the landscape that they're flying over. Anyway, so the birds are using multiple different sort of cues in the same way that a person might, you're on a ship and you take a sighting of a certain star, and then you observe the sort of color of the water that you're sailing over, and so on. You sort of take in multiple pieces of information and make deductions and say, okay, we must be in this place, and the birds are doing something similar or analogous at least. And so if we call the human navigator intelligent because they're sort of making use of different sources of information to bring about a certain goal state, it seems arbitrary to say that the bird's behavior is not sort of doing something similar, the kind of goal directedness, even if the bird is not doing explicit calculations in the way that the navigator might be. And then, of course, extending that even one step further, the embryo that became that bird is also, behaving in a certain way. It's moving parts of itself around and creating proteins and so on. And so this again is sort of like there's no sort of like dividing line where you can say everything on one side of this line is development of the embryo, and then everything on the other side of this line is behavior. It's just that there's a sort of continuity between the embryo doing things to itself to develop into the adult organism, and then the adult organism doing things to itself to affect changes in the world outside of it. There's a sort of continuity between those two sort of kinds of activity.
The point that he makes here, he says that what is true for instinctive behavior is equally true for intelligent behavior. In humans and in chimpanzees, the instinctive gesture is often the germ of element. I was reading a little while ago about, I think it's an article in New York Times about, in the science section, about chimpanzee like gesture repertoires. I can't remember exactly how many gestures the average chimpanzee is capable. I think it was something like 16. More than you might initially assume. And many of the gestures are relatively concrete and sort of very close to, I guess, what the action that the chimpanzee wants to accomplish. Like if another chimpanzee is eating, holding out another chimpanzee got its hand towards the is obviously sort of a gesture of like taking, but it's a bit abstracted, because it's not just reaching out to take the food; it's indicating to the other chimpanzee that it would like that chimpanzee. So yeah, it's I guess easy to see the beginnings of more complex, less concrete symbolic behavior.
Yeah, that brings up actually maybe like a sort of counter argument to what Ruyer is talking about here. So I think we might have I think I might have brought this up during the Merleau-Ponty group, but there's this famous experiment with Coco the gorilla. So there have been many attempts over the years to try to teach various apes human languages. So one of the big obstacles is the articulatory apparatus, where something maybe we don't think about that much, but like the human mouth and throat area is very specialized for speech compared to other apes. Like just the physical movements that are involved in pronouncing various sounds are pretty intricate and complicated, and like the very precise in terms of timing and location. And apes in general are not capable of producing, other apes like chimpanzees and gorillas are not capable of producing those sounds. And then so the sort of two main approaches for evaluating whether these apes can learn human languages are sign languages, like sort of adapting like real human sign languages to try to teach parts of it to these apes, and then also the other one is like a sort of keyboard that has like a bunch of symbols on it, and get the ape to press a symbol to express a certain concept. And so one of these experiments with gorillas was using the keyboard sort of approach. And so they had an adult female learning. They were sort of training this gorilla to use the keyboard. And this is like an extremely laborious process because you have to sort of develop you have to do sort of like a conditioning like process with each of these signs to get them to sort of associate this sign with this. This pressing this key is like the key for banana. You have to sort of reward them for pressing the key when there's a banana, many times before they actually make that association. But yeah, so this adult female also had a newborn sort of just hanging out with her at the time. And so this newborn was given the name Coco, and Coco actually learned how to use these signs much better than the mother did. So like the when they trained the adult gorillas, they sort of like they learn a few signs, but they don't really sort of I think maybe they learn like 100 or a couple hundred of these signs, but they don't really use the signs in any sort of syntactic connection. They just sort of like if they want a banana, they'll just press the banana key like 50 times in a row or something. But Coco was able to learn not just like these sort of individual sign association to an object, but like how to combine the signs syntactically. So you could like give a sequence of signs that Coco had never experienced before, and then you give like an instruction to say like put the banana on top of the box or something, and then and so of course to perform this task correctly, you have to not just sort of understand what each of these signs mean, but like grasp the connection. Like putting the banana on top of the box is different than putting the box on top of the banana. And yeah, so the Coco was able to grasp the sort of syntactic connection of these signs and produce new sentences and understand new sentences. Obviously not like very elaborate ones with subordinate clauses and so on, but new sort of connections of these signs with each other. And so it does seem that this is a sort of qualitatively different use of the sort of symbol keyboard than the adult gorillas that are just sort of learning an association between one key and a certain object, grasping a sort of abstract relationship between objects, that is sort of expressed by putting the signs together in a certain way. That seems like a qualitatively different grasp of what these signs are for, or how they work. Actually, that brings to mind also, I mean, so yeah, slightly a bit of a tangent, but I think when we were reading the other Ruyer book, the cybernetics one, I posted some of these images that result when you ask ChatGPT to draw a bicycle and label all the parts. The results are not particularly impressive. And this is like a similar kind of problem where, because identifying the parts of a bicycle, this is kind of requires like grasping not just a set of labels that this object is associated with this word, but also grasping the connections of all these different objects, component parts of the bicycle. How does the chain relate to the pedals? How do the handlebars relate to the wheel, etc.? Like all these different things have to be connected to each other in a specific way to make a bicycle. It's not just a sort of jumble of parts. And this seems to be like the element that ChatGPT and LLMs in general are not really capable of getting, is this sort of like structured connection between components. And this is like precisely this sort of syntactic aspect that Coco was able to grasp, but the adult gorillas were not able to grasp. So like rather than just sort of giving a string of symbols that sort of each point to like an object, and then sort of like hoping that the audience can grasp, given these objects, what the sort of desire is, being able to express a specific relationship between these concepts, A on top of B versus B on top of A, that requires the same kind of like grasp of a structure and how the different parts fit into that structure. So it does seem like this is something, that obviously is not unique to humans, but is a qualitatively different sort of way of relating to objects and the world, compared to just sort of this kind of responding to signals coming in from the world in often very sophisticated ways, but not in this sort of abstract syntactic structure way. Oh yes, I just muted for a second too. I was going to type. Maybe we can go on to the next bit. So yeah, I believe we are at to interpret the totality of facts. If someone could pick up from there. Organelles, do you want to try again? Yes.
Okay, so we're starting at paragraph 2, totality. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. To interpret the totality of facts, we have to climb back from intelligence to instinct, and from instinct to organogenesis. Because sense and finality exist in intelligent activity, they have to exist in instinct and in the organism. The mode of this finality can and must be deemed different for each level. Profound differences can exist between organic finality, instinctive finality, and intelligent finality, but it is simply impossible to admit an absolute difference of nature between these levels. To admit that a senseful behavior in an external circuit could emerge from an organism that would be a pure set of physical phenomena connected by a step-by-step causality. If X's conversation is meaningful, the constitution of his larynx and his brain must have been meaningful work. The organism is the first of meaningful works. Biology cannot be separated from comprehensive sciences. Admittedly, biology, for the most part, explains facts. It studies structures and mechanisms, and it approaches the organism in this way. This is not surprising because the organism is a set of organs that resemble, despite their superior complexity, the machinery of human industry. But a sense dominates this whole arsenal, just as the minds of men dominate their entire machinery. After a meticulous studies of techniques, Leroy Gorhan sought to bring biology and technology closer together. Technical intention and creation extend the instinctive movement by which the living being strives to, quote, make contact, unquote. The evolution of techniques has to be expressed in biological images. Diffusion and segregation, mutation and heredity. If we are looking for technology's real family, then we need to orient ourselves toward paleontology, toward biology in the broad sense. It is because the tool and the machine extend organic activity that they always remain subordinate to it and have no persistence of their own. Woodger notes, quote, "A machine is made to realize some conscious human purpose. Its parts work together to secure that, not to secure its own persistence. Machines are subordinate to organic persistence. They are used by human organisms for the purpose of securing their own persistence, or the persistence of something that may be valuable to them. A machine may in fact be regarded as part of an organism of a peculiar kind, linked to the rest of psychological as well as biological ties." Unquote. We can add that the instruments and machines we use perish in principle at the same time as our bodies. Like the organism, machines that have not been consciously maintained become corpses whose quote unquote form is only a structural appearance. Mechanistic biology is not necessarily anti-finalist. We can claim that mechanistic biology is more naturally finalist than anti-finalist. It seems anti-finalist only because the theorist forgets that humans create the machine and that humans are organisms. Should I finish it out here?
Yeah, there's only a couple paragraphs left in this chapter, so let's go to the end of the chapter. Thanks.
In the 17th century, minds as profoundly religious as Bossuet, Malebranche, and Nicole accept and admired the mechanistic biology and medicine inspired by Descartes. Quote, "The ear has convenient cavities for making the voice reverberate in the same way that it reverberates in rocks and echoes. The vessels have their valves turned in every direction. The bones and muscles have their pulleys or levers. They admired all the more this marvelous art, that for them, it goes without saying, presupposed an artist. If Cartesian anatomists like Dionne and Stenen were reluctant to speak of final causes before the mechanism or mechanics of the body, it is not because they doubted its finality in general, but because they feared the temerity of those who claimed to know the use and the precise and particular end of this or that organ. Like Paley and the finalists of the 18th century, Malebranche dealt with the famous theme of the clock. Quote, "It should be noted that all this happens mechanically. This is why we are bound to admire the incomprehensible wisdom of the being who has so well arranged all these forces, that it is sufficient for an object to touch the optic nerve lightly in this or that way to produce so many different movements in the heart, and even in the face." Unquote. It is certainly not by equating the organism to a set of machines that we will manage to elude teleology. Every explanation of organic teleology that relies on an analogy to machines amounts to explaining internal teleology by means of external teleology. But in both cases, a teleology is always at stake. The cruder the mechanism, as was Descartes, the cruder the corresponding teleology. The more the human body resembles an automaton, the more God resembles. And it is typical that Quinat André Tetry's thesis, the equating of the organ and the tool, is today deemed to be finalist in inspiration. Rightly so. And apologies for my pronunciation of names.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so here he's pointing out that, in maybe like commentary from biologists, there's often this understanding of a mechanistic point of view as being anti-teleology, that the sort of choice is between understanding organisms in terms of final causes or goal directedness on the one hand, and then a mechanistic explanation on the other hand. But he points out here that of course machines always are built by people with goals. You never find, and this is like a stock argument from like 18th century, this sort of tradition of natural theology that, so he mentions Paley here, belongs to this tradition, is that if you are walking along a beach and you find a pocket watch sitting there, with all these little gears and levers and everything, the sort of intricate arrangement of parts, then you assume, like you just automatically assume that this pocket watch was not just sort of like spontaneously assembled by like some sort of geological process. Like you assume that there was a person who extracted the minerals and made the gears and put them together in a certain way, etc. All of this is a sort of goal directedness that is sort of implicit in the existence of this machine. So when you compare an animal's body to a machine, that is not exactly a strong case against goal directedness. What it's doing instead is sort of like taking the goal directedness out of the animal's body itself, like this sort of internal teleology, and then putting it somewhere else. In this case, in this creator who built the animal's body with all these carefully designed valves and levers and so on. Even like Darwin was very aware of this sort of natural theology tradition and considered it to be sort of an important sort of point that he had to address. And what he's doing is essentially, instead of having this creator who puts together the animal body in by assembling all the parts in the right way, instead he sort of diffuses it through the operation of natural selection. But it's still this sort of like the teleology here has been sort of like diffused throughout the population of organisms. The teleology now is just the sort of differential heritability of traits in the population. So this machine comparison starts to break down at that level, but it's still when you kind of lose the ability to compare an organism to a machine if you don't at least keep some teleological concepts around, and this is something that we've talked about before, that even the concept of a function in the most sort of abstract sense, if you say that like the lungs are for breathing, the function of the lungs is respiration, this is already sort of teleological language, and if you are such a sort of a consistent dedicated anti-teleologist to say that it's not actually correct to say that the lungs are for breathing, or the function of the lungs is breathing. If you sort of deny that statement, then you're kind of like, it's very hard to even sort of make any sensible claims about biological processes anymore. This machine analogy is maybe not quite as good as an argument against teleology as it might seem, because we only really are able to make use of a machine analogy when we are sort of at the same time using teleological concepts, there's sort of a pair of coordinate concepts, like structure and function are sort of coordinate concepts that you can only grasp some sort of organ or tissue or whatever it is in a living being as a determinate structure if you at the same time take it to have a certain function. So breaking down an organism into the parts that are structured in a certain way is only makes sense if you are thinking of those parts in terms of function. Like even just deciding that a part that makes sense for the organism is the skeleton or the circulatory system or whatever it is, like to say that this is a part, a real part of the organism, rather than say like 1 cubic centimeter in the left part of the leg, I don't know, whatever, some random sort of geometrical part, segment of the organism is not a real part because it has no functional significance, whereas the skeleton or the circulatory system does have functional significance. So even at the level of like, where do you sort of make the cuts in your division of the organism into parts, that you already have to sort of presuppose some sort of functional category to say that this is a real part of the organism, a part that has significance for the life process of this organism, and not just a sort of arbitrary geometrical segment of this organism. Yeah. So organelles has put notes in the chat here. Yeah, I think those are some of the key points of this chapter. So yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, I'm not going to read the whole thing for the listening audience, but yeah, just some like I think four sort of key points drawn from this chapter. Yeah, maybe the last point is something we can discuss a little bit because we haven't talked about that much. But the idea here is that we when we attribute meaning to intelligent human behavior, the person who builds a machine, for example, is doing so for the sake of a certain goal. We should not see that as a sort of emergence of meaning, or a sort of a sudden appearance of meaning that wasn't there before. So it's only if the person's actions in general have meaning that their production of a machine can also have meaning, and the person's actions can only have meaning if if the sort of organogenesis that produced the body that is capable of acting in that way is also finalistic in that sense. Yeah, and so on. So like you can't there's sort of you can't make sense of a sort of sudden emergence of finality or meaning or goal directedness at one sort of point in this continuum. We have to sort of bite the bullet and say that this finality or finalistic character is there sort of all the way down. That it never sort of first appears. And so he's even willing to sort of push this argument all the way to subatomic particles. They also have this finalistic character because they are true forms and not just aggregates.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were saying that if a completely automated process of machine production would sort of be a counter argument against that claim that something that has finality or a sense can't emerge from sort of non-finalistic activity, that I guess at some point you would need as along the lines of the argument in the cybernetics book, you would need some framing consciousness to set up the whatever machine is first in the series of automatic production of other machines, and so you would still have a framing case.
Yeah, so like if you think of semiconductor or like the manufacture of computer chips, for example, like a chip that's in your phone or laptop or whatever is far too complicated and sort of intricate and precise for like a person to manually draw all these tiny circuits on a board. So it's very automated and like extremely complicated process, involves lasers and all kinds of things. But at the same time, there has to be a person who actually inputs the design of the chip into the machine, pays the electricity bill. All these things have to all the very automated factory process that makes these chips is embedded within a social institution of a company that is making and selling these chips. And so there are people that have to make decisions to say, okay, we want to produce X amount of this type of chip, and we're going to buy these raw materials and use this amount of electricity and so on. So all of these things have to be there and set up the whole process, get the whole process going before this automated manufacturing process can even start. If at some point we get our AI overlords that are capable of doing all those things on their own, maybe that would be an exception to this. But then again, you'd still have the sort of historical process, out of which that AI overlord comes about. The whole development of computer technology, where it was humans who were designing and producing these computers until we reached that stage of the singularity, as the AI people like to call it. So that whole historical background would still be, would still require the sort of human decision making all along the way until the computer gets to that point where it's capable of manufacturing its own components and organizing all of the inputs of materials and electricity and all of that stuff. Yeah, so maybe in response to this comment that Organelles puts in the chat here, maybe I wouldn't compare it directly to the embryogenesis thing quite as, or maybe quite not quite as directly, but Ruyer talks about, I think it's in this book as well, he talks about how, like, you can perform certain calculations in your head. You can, as someone who has like gone through elementary school, you sort of memorize the times table and so on. But you can also perform the same calculations using, in his age, in his time, that would have been, a mechanical calculator with like gears and so on that you would input numbers into. But today, an electronic calculator. So you can sort of externalize this process. You can take something that you could perform in your head, very laboriously and with high risk of errors. You can sort of externalize it to this mechanical or electronic device. But in principle, it's the same kind of task either way. So, the activity that is being done in this electronic or mechanical device is kind of an externalization of like I don't know, a cognitive machine, you could say. You've sort of like built up this machine inside yourself through the sort of rote repetition of the times table to the point where you can perform these operations in your head. But then you can also, externalize that task to this machine. And then, of course, you can, the development of, say, computer technology has been, I guess, one of the sort of trends of that development has been to offload more and more of the tasks to the machine. So where maybe early machines you would have to like if you think of the sort of mechanical calculators, they don't do anything, until the person actually enters a set of numbers, and then the wheels turn and then gives a different set of numbers, and then the person has to write those numbers down or something. But then you have more sophisticated machines where you can say input like an electronic machine where you can input say a series of equations and have each one sort of feed into the next one. Like you take the results of one equation, feed that into the second one, and so on. And maybe that gives you like a whole series of calculations for, I don't know, missile trajectory or whatever it is. And then of course today we can have much more complicated. You think of like rendering video, based on like a 3D model or something like that. So this obviously involves probably many millions of calculations that no individual person has like sort of inputted into the machine. Instead, you have this much more abstract sort of set of rules for like how to generate those equations based on the 3D configuration of the room in which this scene is supposed to be rendered. So yeah, there's like more and more sort of externalization of these tasks onto the machine, as opposed to having the person perform them and then maybe take the machine to do one step of the process. So yeah, I think maybe we could see like tool use as in other domains as analogous to this. So instead of like grinding the food with your own teeth, you build mechanical teeth that grind the food for you and make the job easier, and so on. Like, and then even this extremely automated chip factory, for example, is kind of an externalization, but it's a very specialized externalization that even sort of extends the capacity that a human would never be able to put millions or billions of circuits on one tiny chip. It's just too small and precise for a human to do without some sort of automation. But it's in principle, it's just sort of extending the capacity that humans have to draw a line and so on, but making it much more precise than a human could.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And I'm kind of like going out there with this comment, but it's interesting that in this chapter, when he talks about tools as extensions of internal processes, and you're talking about this extension of ourselves through the lasers and everything to make these small chips. What would that be an extension of? What's the correlate in human biology there? I mean, I guess it's hands or something, but
yeah. So in the very early computers, you actually had to physically patch the different sections. Like you like to run a certain program, you had to solder wires in a certain arrangement to say these two input wires will be joined in an AND connection, and then these ones will be an OR, etc. And then if you wanted to run a different program, you had to actually tear the wires out and solder them in a different way. Obviously, this is like extremely time-consuming and laborious. And that's where the sort of the idea of a programmable computer comes from, is that you have sort of a basic set of operations and then an input set of instructions that the computer can read. And so without having to physically change the configuration of wires and so on, the computer can take these instructions and then run them. And so it can, sort of take in any set of instructions, and then run, can do multiplication or, calculating trajectories or rendering a 3D scene, obviously depending on how much processing power and memory and so on the device actually has. So you can see this sort of program running capacity of the machine as a kind of extension of this, physical operation of soldering wires. So I think likewise you can see the microchip fabrication sort of processing as an extension of, say, that very macroscopic, process where you are taking components and connecting them in a certain way, where you would say, like, here's an AND gate, here's a XOR gate, etc., and sort of like linking them to each other. Now you're doing that, many billions of times over on a tiny scale that no one could ever do in unassisted manual work. But it's as if you are like extending your capacity to manually manipulate these components into a much smaller and more precise domain than any human hands ever could. Okay, so I know Angus has to leave pretty soon, and we're at a chapter break, so I'm going to suggest that we stop here and then pick up on from the beginning of chapter 4 next time.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I have to leave soon. That sounds good to me.
All right. When is going to be the next reading? Maybe it's
so we'll pick.
south.
So we'll pick up from chapter 4. Yeah, we'll just read however far we get. Probably 5 or 6 pages, I think, is where we're normally our normal pace. But yeah, we can go as quickly or as slowly as we want. Okay, yeah. So thanks everyone for coming out today, and hopefully see you next week.